I grew up in Montana, in Great Falls, Montana, next to Malmstrom Air Force Base. And Malmstrom is one of a handful of Air Force bases in the country where Minuteman 1, 2, and 3 missiles are buried and made. Actually, Boeing had their huge Minuteman contract there, right there on the Air Force Base, right next to in the town that I lived in and grew up in. And if you don't know what a Minuteman missile is, it's a long-range intercontinental ballistic missile that can carry up to 3 nuclear warheads. So here I was about 8, 9, 10 years old, and it was the Cold War. On ABC, they premiered this film called The Day After, which was the effects of a nuclear war. It wasn't so much what precedes a nuclear war, but what happens after a nuclear war, which was horrifying to me. My mom allowed me to watch it, and her pragmatism was of little comfort to me, though now I appreciate it. Her pragmatism was that, well, we'd be hit first, so we'd just be dead. We'd just be dead. We wouldn't be suffering. And, it was somewhat comforting at the time, but what happened was Boeing offered her a job, and she was going to be able to work for this company on the Minuteman. I really felt strongly that she shouldn't work for Boeing, that was a scary, scary thing for her to be part of this arms proliferation, and she decided not to take the job. So somewhere in there I felt, just through talking with my mom, that I had influenced her. So there was that. There's the Cold War and the nuclear missiles right there basically in my backyard. But my other backyard, my home, so to speak, was a couple 100 miles away in a place called Opportunity. And Opportunity was a little farming town where my Croatian great-grandparents had homesteaded and built their homes and their barn and their chicken coop. And Opportunity was the name given by the Anaconda Copper Company, the mining company that was mining copper out of Butte, Montana. Well, over the years, I began to understand the effects of that mine in Butte. It's an open pit mine, strip mined, later became the U.S.'s largest Superfund site right now. So it's a pit, open pit mine, acid leached, that's slowly filling with water, and that water's toxic. I don't know if you've ever heard about the famous swans landing on the Berkeley pit. There were 300 and some swans that landed on the Berkeley pit, who later, the next few days, the whole flock died. And that's at the headwaters of the Columbia River. At the beginning of the last century, the Anaconda Copper Company built a dam to power their operations upstream. So as the toxic tailings were flowing downstream before, now they were stopping at the Milltown Dam and building up. And over the course of a century, 6.6 million cubic yards of toxic mine tailings built up behind that mine. And well-intentioned environmentalists, as well as some environmental cleanup companies and the modern-day copper king, Dennis Washington, we're going to clean it up. Mm-hmm. So what cleanup meant was dredging the mine, or the dam, taking down the dam and finding a place for those tailings. And lo and behold, the place was Opportunity. So I had a chance to go home to Opportunity this last summer, where they've been filling the land with those 6.6 million cubic yards of lead, cadmium, arsenic, all the stuff of mining, open pit mining. And it's a landscape flattened and surrounded by fences, and the water is poison. And this was my home. It was like a visceral loss of something absolutely inherent in my body. I felt a loss of it when I visited. I saw it, and I went to my great-grandparents' houses no one lives there anymore. They're kind of shuttered up, and the land is filled with junk, and it's decomposing, and it was very sad. And I stood there in front of my grandmother's house that I had spent so much time at as a child, and just wept. And my son, River, somehow he saw it, and he, amidst everybody, a large number of my family was there, he came over and he just held me. He's a 17-year-old that doesn't do a lot of mommy holding these days, and he just came over and he hugged me. And I know that he was hugging me not only because he registered my loss, but that he also felt loss. So I know what it is to lose one's home to what we think is necessary evil, copper. The thing that I came to was we're doing it in Alberta with the tar sands, which is north of Montana, and that bitumen extraction also has tailings ponds, and those tailings ponds are twice the size of the Berkeley pit right now. And they have, just shell alone plans to double their process. So the Athabascan Chippewa people are experiencing the same thing that I experienced, only on a scale much larger. And it's just not right. It's not right. And it feels to me like those losses have fueled the direction that my life has gone.
I grew up just outside of Boston on the North Shore in Redding, and where I lived on the end of a dead-end road that was surrounded by woods and fields and marshes and swamps, and I spent a childhood in nature, encouraged by my mother, who grew up on a farm in Ontario, which I visited often in the summer. So a real connection to the natural world. And I can remember when I was probably like 12 or 13 years old, we lived about 2 miles from 128, which is a major highway outside of Boston, and they were just putting in 93, the new interstate that was going to go from Boston up into New Hampshire. I can remember being out in the fields there and seeing the surveyors there surveying the property that they were going to put in this new highway. And I can remember at an early age recognizing that something was really wrong with this. I saw these large earth-moving equipment and such ready to tear the earth up. And I can remember as a kid having this urge to tear up the surveying stakes and wanting to stand in the way of what I saw as just this real rape of the earth. I felt it intuitively.
I come from a family of old hippies who were active in the anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s, and so I grew up in a household that was very forthwith about the need to be critical thinking in terms of the way that our systems work. And so I've always sort of had a healthy skepticism, and I think really what got me first was my pacifist nature. The first time I ever really found myself getting involved in political activism was in 2003 when we invaded Iraq for reasons that had nothing to do with 9/11, but they were talking about them as if they were. I got into a really bad car accident about a year after I started attending the school. And it was severe enough that I almost lost my life. And so when I healed and came back to the school, I had a larger sense of urgency to do something because I became more in touch with my mortality at a younger age. And so I really started getting the sense that I don't have an endless amount of time to make change, I guess would be the way to put it. So when my school offered to take a contingent of students to Washington, D.C. for the Forward on Climate rally, I decided to go, which I normally wouldn't have made that decision. I've got kids at home, Jason's at home, Jason being my husband, and something just kind of clicked and changed, and considering a lot of the education I was getting was based on environmental issues and particularly the effect of climate change on the environment, it seemed like the time to do it. So I went, and when I got back, the school made sure that we unpacked the experience. We didn't just go and march and come home and that was that. It was important that the school sort of underscore what it was we could learn from it, not just from the experience, but how we could implement what we learned moving forward. And so they hooked me up with 350 Main, and from there it was sort of history.
When I moved to Pittsfield, I immediately went to the UU church. I just thought that's where I'll find people of the same like-mindedness, and I did. And I spent a few years just sort of learning about the church, learning how things worked, participating, in all of the things that go on at any given church. And I didn't pay any attention to their books. Well, meanwhile, I'm paying a lot of attention to what's going on in the world in terms of like fracking and all this offshore drilling and all the disaster and the everything that's going on. I pay a lot of attention to. I read about the tar sands, everything I'm paying close attention to, and I'm reading about what we should be doing to counteract that. Reading Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein and keeping very informed. And one day I'm standing in the kitchen looking over the annual report for our church, and I see ExxonMobil dividend as a major source of sustaining capital for our church. And I'm standing there in the kitchen with my husband, explaining this to him. Meanwhile, my son was sitting at the table, now 17, he was 15 years old, sitting at the table not listening because he doesn't listen to what Vaughn and I talk about. And he had his headphones in, wasn't listening, and I said to Vaughn, we have this much ExxonMobil stock, and we have this many shares and this many dividends. And River said, what? And he was incredulous. He was like, the zealous nature of a teenage boy came out, and the you are a hypocrite came out in that one utterance. That what? And he looked at us, and he was confused, and he was angry and judging, and all of those things that teenagers are very good at doing with their parents. But in this instance, he was right, and he didn't say anything more. He put his headphones back on. But that moment has stuck with me since it happened, because I realized that everything I'd been trying to teach River, all the activism that I had been a part of, the justice work, the environmental work, seemed to me to be riding on that moment. Because if this church was investing in the future of Exxon, he knew where the future of Exxon was taking us because of all of the things I've been talking to him about. I knew at that moment that I either had to leave the church or I had to get the church to think about divesting from fossil fuels. So that's where the journey began. And for now a little over 2 years, we've been working on first getting past what felt like impolite conversation, then getting it on the council agenda, then moving into what does divestment mean? Does it mean we just sell Exxon? Does it mean we clear our portfolios completely? And then in all the way to where we're at now, which is reinvesting in socially responsible funds, completely fossil fuel free. So a long journey. It's been uncomfortable, and and very worthwhile in my mind. But the point I'm trying to make is, though it's a small church, all of the aspects of people's responses, people's fears, they were all there. They're maybe a little more intimate and a little more casual than might happen in a larger church. I think all of the details of going through that process we went through and are still actually in some cases going through today as we look to what it means to invest in companies we believe in, as opposed to just getting a share in return, so that we can then take that money and invest it in something that we think does good in the world.
Once I started getting involved with 350 Main, and then my husband kind of joined in, and we actually did make an impact. I mean, one of the first campaigns that we worked on with them was a campaign against extreme extraction, particularly oil trains that were moving through Maine. And we started going to meetings where we were helping to organize an action where we were going to block a train that was supposed to be coming through, actually coming right by my daughter's school, and it was carrying explosive fracked oil from the Bakken oil fields. At the time I thought, well, this is no good, because I had done enough research to know that the train cars that were carrying the oil were kind of faulty, and that if the train were to derail, it was very likely that there would be an oil spill, and I didn't want to see the waterways nearby getting polluted where I know that they were delivering water to my kids' school. And we started to, like I said, organize and go to these meetings. And we ended up going through with it on June 28th of 2013. We ended up blocking a train, and 10 days later, a train derailed in Lac-Mégantic in Canada, and it exploded and killed about 50 people in the center of this really small town. Even now, I just got goosebumps talking about it. I mean, at the time that we made the choice to do that, it was an environmental concern pretty much only. But it became very clear at that point that, you know, human life was at stake as well. And as I did research, I came to find that these train companies and railroads were pretty keenly aware of the fact that the train cars carrying the oil were faulty, and they were pushing them through anyway. So since there has not been oil trains coming through Maine, and so we were able to make a direct link between people power and the ability to make change. This was something that we did on our own to help assert local control, and it worked, and we were able to talk to my daughter Jade about it and let her know that, you know, one voice, one person can make a big difference. You know, I'm only one person, but I was one of 5 other people who got arrested that night blocking the train, and it ended up getting a lot of fanfare, and there was a lot of talk and dialogue around these oil trains, and then it stopped. And so she started to get more of a sense of the fact that perhaps she could make a change as well. And so a few months later, when there was legislation going through to be heard for the divestment of the Maine Public Pension Fund, I talked to Jade a little bit and said, hey, you know, I'm going to be reading testimony for the president of my school, Stephen Mulkey. And I talked to her a little bit about it, and I was really excited about it. And on her own, she said, well, do you think maybe I could do something there? And I thought, yes, you could definitely do something there, and how appropriate. Because, you know, when it comes to extreme fossil fuel extraction and the connection that it has to climate change and who's going to be most widely affected by that, it's the youth of the country. And so it seemed to me the most appropriate voice at that hearing would be the one of a child. And so I said emphatically, yes, as a matter of fact, please, why don't you write a draft, bring it to me, we'll see if it needs any editing, and, you know, we'll do a little bit of practicing, and you know what, I'll let you take the day off of school so you can come and do this, because I feel experiential learning is working for me at school, and it can work for you, and there's a lot of different ways that we can learn, and I think teaching her you know, the legislative process and teaching her that she's got power as an individual was just as important as learning, you know, 2 times 2. So we went ahead and came, and she gave her testimony, and I think she did a really good job.
I've been working with 350 Maine ever since Bill McKibben came to Portland. I guess that was about 2 years ago, this past November. And listening to Bill McKibben in the Do the Math tour, that really spoke to me. I can't remember having been moved as much as maybe since all the way back to the Vietnam War and back in the 60s. Because I've spent a career teaching high school sciences, particularly physics and earth science. And so I followed climate change for the last 40 years and in climate science. And I felt a tremendous frustration, but inability to really take action. And Bill McKibben spoke to how we can all take action. So I've started working with 350 Maine, as I said, about 2 years ago. And with that involvement, I found that it really needed to become more local, needed to become more right here in the community which I live, which is Freeport. I've lived here for more than 30 years now. And I went to a town council meeting last summer, inspired by the council in South Portland, because in the last year, more than a year, I've been involved with the Clear Skies ordinance down there and did a lot of canvassing and really got to know that community well, went to a lot of the city council meetings, and I was so impressed with how local democracy worked and how the inspiration of those people who organized the citizens of South Portland and what they did in keeping tar sands from their community. I felt that I really needed to pay more attention to what was going on in my own community. In that council meeting, the proposal to bring the Metro bus from Portland out to Freeport was being talked about. And one of the councilors was opposed to it and gave tremendously nonsensical answers to why he was opposed. And I wrote him emails and he never responded, never gave me any, he never even wrote back and said that he received them. And then I found out that he was running unopposed for re-election. And I said, wait a second. So that's when I took out papers to run for a town council, and lo and behold, 4 months after going to that first council meeting, which I'd never been to one before, ever, now I'm on the town council. And now I'm trying to figure out, you know, as a council member, what can we actually do as a town to address climate change? And I'm just learning that the town already is doing a lot of things, and there are a lot of people in town who are taking action. So I hope to be able to help those actions along and just learn more about what we can as a community do, which I'm finding it's a lot.
Yeah. Since you've been a teacher and so on, what kind of involvement do you see for youth and young people in this movement on climate change and also right here in Freeport?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I'd like to do is to reach out to the teachers here in Freeport, because I've heard that there's one teacher whose students are very eager to get involved with the divestment movement, which would be wonderful. Another teacher, might be the same teacher, had students who came before the council last summer with a plastic bag ban, or with a request to ban plastics. So that's another thing to be looking at, involving students in taking action. So I think Freeport has a tradition of being a leader on environmental issues, and it would be nice to see that Freeport could continue with that.
You know, honestly, when you look at the problems we're facing, it's not that hard. It's just moving money around. You know, we're facing these huge problems, and this is a real first world problem. Where am I going to put my money? That's what I have taken away from the whole process, is the fact that, one, I had to be a part of a community to begin with. I couldn't come in as some stranger that wouldn't wash dishes and tell them how to do things. So without, with no idea about divesting as a plan, I became a part of this community, and I established myself as someone who could be counted on, and then moved into a position of leadership on the council. And by being civically active like that already, and a part of a community already, then I had a voice, and a voice that people would listen to, maybe disagree with, but definitely I had this voice that seemed to come from being already part of a community, instead of being an outsider coming in saying this is how things should be done.
What's next for you?
I'm not sure, actually. I feel like I will continue with the divestment journey. I've always looked at it as like starting with my church. If I could make a victory work there, then I would have a base from which to work outward in circles, So I visited the Bangor UU Church, and I visited the Waterville UU Church. Divestment makes so much sense to me. I want to continue helping with that. I'm working with 350 Main, and though I have a baby on the way, so there'll be some stalling of action, outward action in the world. It just makes so much sense to talk with people about their money, because that's really what gets people afraid, and it gets them talking. No matter if they agree or disagree, when you begin talking about money, they begin talking about the issues. So, when it began at our church, we began talking about divesting from fossil fuels. Talking about money got us talking about everything, right? We talked about climate change, and we talked about fossil fuels, and we talked about scientists, and what does science have to do with our faith? And then when we got to the reinvesting part, we talked about all of the ethics that you could possibly think of in terms of investing in nuclear war or prostitution or tobacco. We went through everything. And so by virtue of talking about money, you're talking about so much more. So I think it's a very powerful tool. I think I'll stick with helping out in that way, and sharing my story.
I was just introduced. My name is Sass Linnekin. I'm a proud senior from Unity College. I'm particularly proud because Unity College was the first college in the country to divest from fossil fuel holdings. I'm here to represent the Maine Students for Climate Justice. Over the course of a year, MSCJ has organized Maine student involvement in XL Dissent in DC, the People's Climate March in New York, and we did so to hold our national and global leaders accountable.
So I'm Miles. I am a senior at Bowdoin College, and a few years ago I helped start the campaign to divest the college from fossil fuels. So essentially, Bowdoin College, which is ostensibly dedicated to the common good, is invested in companies that are contributing to that sort of painful destruction of the natural landscape and to indigenous culture, and there's sort of a discrepancy, right? And so we're after 2.5 years of campaigning and more than 1,000 student signatures, we were able to present to our board of trustees last month. Sort of recommending fossil fuel divestment. We were, I think, fairly well received. The trustees were engaged and asked decent questions. But so right now we're in the process of identifying trustees, see which of them might be able to lead the charge on this, because it seems as if we can get a leader who's able to sort of bypass the president, we might have victory in our sights. And so next semester, we're really sort of planning on ramping up our efforts and forcing them to make a decision and either declare themselves to be on the right side of history or sort of show themselves to be invested in the sort of awful practices of the past.
Maine Students for Climate Justice are organizing an unprecedented action to show Governor LePage, Maine's elected officials, and all Mainers that we as students and young people demand an economy that works for people and the planet. Our goal is to have at least 1,000 students in front of the Blaine House this spring, demanding a clean energy future. We want students of all ages to protest because we believe with a strong and united front, one made up of the youth who will deal most directly with the fallout of climate change, we can push change. Because I think about the military-industrial complex, and I think it was people taking to the streets that put an end to the Vietnam War. They took to the streets and they stopped it, and that was one of the most powerful institutions in the world, the United States military-industrial complex. And they took to the streets and they won. And I think these are the kind of things that it's probably typical for somebody to look at and say, this is just such an enormous problem that there's no way we can overtake it. But really, I think it's a lot about perspective. We can look at some of the problems as really large burdens that we have to carry and figure out how to fix in like kind of a stressful sort of lens if we want, or we can look at it as an opportunity to get creative. You know, there's never been a more important time than now to make changes, and we have the ability to create a new way of living, and we have to. There's no way that we can sustain living the way that we do now, so we're alive in a really exciting time where we have the ability to kind of take out the proverbial paintbrush and say, this is the world I want to see, and make it so. There has never been a more important time to fight than now, and we are the future. We say the injustices of fossil fuels will be history.
I want to introduce the first one real quick. The first one is me, Alice Hotop, who's a student at Colby College. Thanks so much, Alice.
I'm a student at Colby College, and I'm here tonight because I want to stop climate change. We want to stop climate change, right?
My name is Iris Sangiovanni. I've lived all of my 19 years in South Portland, and I am now a freshman studying political science at the University of Southern Maine, and I am a member of the Student Coalition of Maine Students for Climate Justice. I'm here today to talk about my involvement in both the UMaine Systems divestment campaign and South Portland's campaign against tar sands oil. And from these experiences, I've observed the true financial power that the oil industry has in our education, our politics, and our future.
I'm an activist because the places I love and the places where I come from are at danger. I started Divest UMaine as a USM student about a year ago.
My name's Kelsey Ouellette. I'm from Winthrop, Maine, but I go to school. I'm a senior at the University of New England in Biddeford. I'm an environmental studies major, so that's what kind of brings me here to talk with everybody. Currently, I'm part of our divestment committee at UNE, as Iris was talking about. And
I'm Heidi Brugger. I'm with 350 Maine. I'm here to support the Bowdoin students who are with Maine Students for Climate Justice. They're presenting the college president with a petition that has the signatures of more than half of the student body calling for divestment. And it's so critical that these higher education institutions divest.
My name is Clara Bellitz. I'm a first year here at Bowdoin, and I've been involved in the divestment movement and Bowdoin Climate Action. And I think it's really cool to see a diverse group of students come together, and not just the students, but community as well, come together for a really important issue. And I think that Bowdoin's commitment to the common good really lines up with the commitment to climate justice and divestment.
The fossil fuel industry goes against all the values we have as Mainers, and that is why we need to divest. Thank you.
We are really excited about the student turnout and the community support. It was everything we wanted it to be from the student perspective. We're disappointed that the administration didn't give us an answer about the Board of Trustees, but we're going to keep pushing. We feel that that's really important, and we are grateful that President Mills was here and responded to this.
the people, living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday